talk about the politics of all this. It's been said sometimes, and I wrote this down, economic indicators are often predictors of electoral fates. So, you know, when the party out of power sees something that's negative for the party in power, they jump on that. And in this case, the economic ills of now are being blamed on Democrats. The big picture is we're coming out of pandemic. So would it matter who's in office right now, or are there subtle things that could be done to ease the inflation process?
You know, I would say 80% of it is going to happen either way, but policies do matter at the margin. And so there are some policies that have contributed to inflation, but by no means are they solely responsible for all of the inflationary.
Contributed to inflation within the last year and a half of this administration, or has it been a continual mounting of different things through the years?
Both. So if you think about what caused inflation, we had the pandemic.
Right.
The pandemic led, as we all know, led us to save a bunch of money because we weren't allowed to go out and spend it. And so consumers came out of the pandemic with substantial savings that they were looking to spend because they'd been sitting on the sidelines for a while. There was also a composition effect. We couldn't buy services during the pandemic, so we switched from services more to goods. And we're seeing over this last summer, people are starting to revert to a normal composition of consumption, and they're switching more to services, air travel, hotel. And so we saw those prices going up early summer. Gasoline, you're able to get out and drive around, take road trips. So the pandemic had that effect, but we also had other issues. We had the government's response. We had 5 different bills to help businesses and individuals weather the pandemic.
And you say some of that was good, except that maybe toward the end it might have been, quote, too good.
Too much, that's right. So, you know, a lot of this stuff early on we had to do. I mean, if we hadn't done it, the consequences would have been much worse, and the effects of the pandemic would have been really bleak. But there at the end, you know, if we look in the beginning of this year, inflation was 1.4% in January, 1.7% in February, and then we pass the American Recovery Plan, which was $2 trillion in government funding after we had just passed a bill in December, the Consolidated Response Act, which added $1 billion in spending in help, and then we have another 1.9 trillion in March, and all of a sudden inflation's 2.6%, 4% in April, 5% in May, 5.2% in June. Now, is that all on that policy? No, but did that policy help spur inflation? Absolutely. That was probably too much, too late. Like that would have been better earlier on, but it was too much once we were in that spot in March.
So what did the supply issues have to do with all of this? Because we have that pent-up energy of people wanting things. The pandemic started in China, and then the pandemic supply issues kind of started in that part of the world as well.
Yeah, so consumers are flush with money. They want to buy goods. Producers, well, they had no workers. Their supply chains were broken. They had no goods. They had to start producing goods. And you just don't, you know, it's just not like you just get stuff. I mean, it's a very complicated process to get all of your inputs from a worldwide network of goods moving around. And so supply chains were broken. Producers weren't able to produce enough goods to satisfy demand. Consumers were flush with money. Too many dollars facing too few goods leads to goods prices going up, and that's exactly what we saw. So we had the pandemic, we had the supply chain issues, we had the government response. We also had our Federal Reserve response. The Fed was printing money, purchasing assets, and lowering rates to stimulate the economy. And then we had a demographic issue. Our population is aging. A lot of those older workers who are very productive workers are on the verge of retirement. When the pandemic hit, they retired for multiple reasons. Right. They had enough saved. The pandemic was potentially dangerous for them in terms of their health. And so I think we saw a response in which more people left the labor force earlier than would have happened without the pandemic. So that tightens the labor supply market. We already have a supply chain issue. Consumers have tons of money. perfect storm for inflation.